as with most things, as in the case of fisheries, particularly when it comes to small island development states, grassroots initiative has been the basis for much of our response to complex issues. So the question I pose to any one of the panelists off the bat, how do we have a just transition that is people-centered and pro-poor? Normally, we're just the consumers of the technology, whether it be engines, freezers. How do we deal with that issue? How do we get them to the table?
Thank you so much, Chair. And that's an excellent question to start us off. So I'd like to ask which one of our panelists would like to respond. Milton.
It's a very, very important question. And the issue of equity and good governance and making sure we understand the different stakeholders that should be involved is very, very important. How we do it, it's difficult, but it starts with proper policy and ensuring that we have the type of consultative processes that will ensure that we are hearing and listening to the voices of all of our stakeholders. And a matter as important as what we're dealing with here, it's extremely important that we make every effort to consult with the people and the different stakeholders, including the most vulnerable and the marginalized and the less visible and the poor, and not just with the powerful and the rich and the influential. We really need to make sure we have robust processes to engage with our people and to get their input and factor that into the decision-making process. Otherwise, we're going to end up with problems and difficulties and solutions that are suboptimal. And it is a challenge that we face, Ian, and so, which is why I say it is such an important area. But increasingly, and within the context of fisheries, you would be aware that we have been looking at our governance frameworks to ensure that we enshrine these participatory processes in our decision-making process, in our planning, and really make a significant effort. I mean, one of the things that we have been doing at the CRFM, and Adele has been helping a lot with this, is just facilitating the communication, exchange of information, and having these types of sessions where we begin to talk with each other and ensure that everybody has the opportunity to participate in the dialogue, because this is a part of it. Of course, this is only the first step. And we have developed, and our council have adopted some policies in recent time to ensure that we have a proper policy framework for ensuring more structured engagement. So in recent years, we have had policies focused on incorporating and ensuring that the voices of fishers are taken on board, and there's a place for them in the discussion regarding blue economic growth generally. We also had a policy dealing with gender and for vulnerable members of our fishing communities, as well as youth, ensuring that we are hearing from everybody. So extremely important to ensure equity in social equity in the programs and policies and measures and projects that we develop.
I think it's a really, really important question as well. Really valuable question. How do we get to move with the beneficiaries to improve their economic loss? To me, one of the very first things I think we need to do is identify the gaps to improve economic resilience for the sector. So we need to look at what currently obtains for the sector, what are the gaps, and the barriers as well to that sort of transition to more effective, more sustainable, more economically beneficial activity fisheries. And as Milton says, it requires conversations with the fisher folk. There's no point in attempting, I think over the years we've used a sort of top-down approach to development. It hasn't worked effectively. And we see it all the time. So we need to engage in the discussions, but the beneficiaries need to be aware of the constraints, need to be aware of the potential opportunities and the barriers as well. Now, they know a lot more about what the circumstance is than we do. Well, maybe we should know as much as they do, but we need to fully understand, they also need to fully understand what is available to them potentially. It requires outside the box thinking. We can't go into transitions with the same approach, business as usual approach to decision making, to improvements in the sector that has not borne fruit over the years. So we need to embrace changes we see taking place today. Our beneficiaries need to be fully aware of what the barriers are, and they know the barriers probably better than we do. We need to identify the gaps and find some solutions to addressing those. Insurance, because fisheries is considered a high-risk sector, it hasn't benefited from the traditional types of donor support or financing that other sectors, agriculture and others, benefited from. So I know we've been struggling over the years, and I say we, the collective we, over the years, and trying to find solutions to the transition to more effective sector. We also have the cultural norms that kind of prevent us from advancing. We need to consider those. We have traditions that define how we operate at sea. Some of those we need to sort of leave behind if we hope to transition. So it has to be a whole of sector type improvement that starts from within, but it's a collective process. It has to be both the beneficiary and our governance mechanisms working together to explore what the opportunities are. The thing also is, we're working against a changing environment. Fish are scarcer now, both from the inshore reef and from Milton this morning, with all the impacts of climate change on our marine ecosystems. Resources are not there like they used to be before. So we also have that challenge to transition to a system that allows us to target resources that are dwindling, maybe in a different place, a different type, may require different gear and methods, and which will require investments as well. So there's no easy solution to this, but it requires a whole of sector approach to defining gaps and opportunities. And every gap is an opportunity. But these are the approaches I think that we can use to addressing this.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Sure. So I would just note that our pilot project with CRFM is working through a cooperative. And I think, to be honest, that's one of the best ways in which one can engage with fisher folk in this context, because once you start looking at climate, carbon offsetting, carbon footprinting, all of this type of stuff is not necessarily that relevant to an individual fisher person. They're connecting into much larger value chains, and Belize has a policy that allocates much of the resource to cooperatives. And so the manner in which we've engaged with this through their board of directors and trying to identify what their priorities are, I think has been a productive approach, and is something that is can only really be addressed at cooperative level, because it simply doesn't have the same kind of value or relevance to fisher folk who are working individually, and there's a need to create that cooperative spirit and cooperative enterprise to tackle these types of challenges. Otherwise, it's very challenging to do on your own. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Yes, go ahead, Christelle.
Thank you. Just a really quick comment to that question, because it's a very important one. And in fact, over the last couple of days, I've been getting to know a few micro, small, medium enterprise entrepreneurs from not just the Caribbean, but also, the Pacific and Sao Tome Principe, from the African SIDS, who are also, very much doing their part. But what is quite confronting is that they aren't at the table being involved in consultations and making the very, very important decisions. And yet when you hear the discussions and the rhetoric, if you like, within, the climate COPs and so on, their suggestion is, well, grant resources will definitely not be enough to address, the challenges we face, and we need to unlock private investments and so on. But we have our own private sector, and I think, and it's at a different scale, but nevertheless they can make some really significant contributions. And so this principle of inclusivity, I think we need to really think about it all the time. Milton might be able to do some comparisons of the various ministerial meetings that the OACPS have had over the years. But at the 7th ministerial meeting held in Accra, Ghana, we in fact involved not just our member states, but also our competent regional technical agencies such as CRFM, but also our regional fisheries, civil society organisations, or our regional fisheries associations across the ACP, and they were able to really interact and have a really good exchange, and are reflected in some of the better decisions, I would offer, made in the declaration, which really considers small-scale fishers and artisanal fishers. So it is really very much about those genuine consultations that Milton talked about, but we have to be genuine. I think sometimes we say that we consult, but we don't normally. But I think the other thing that we've got to also think about is the multiple sectors that have to come to be brought to bear, and we can't, we can't just think about the fisheries and aquaculture sector in isolation. And so while that's complicated, nevertheless, involving all of the various sectors in some of these conversations, as well as important stakeholders and actors going forward, will be absolutely crucial to whether we succeed or not. And I also offer that the central agencies are really very important. The central agencies for economic planning and finance, our foreign ministries, our foreign affairs ministries are important because they often either decide on your budgets or decide on many things in the multilateral spaces, where decisions that impact us happen. But we need to, I think, be very, very conscious that it's a whole of government, it's a whole of country effort, and then it's a whole of regions, and then it's intra-regions. And of course it's the whole world that needs to do something about it, but I do, I said it earlier, and I really do believe the potential of how SIDS unite, not just in these sorts of meetings, but unite on everything, to solve, to own how we solve our problems and the world's problems. I think we have such a contribution to make, and that will only be if we include everybody. We can't do it alone. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister Duggins?
I wanted to highlight, and it's been said here, the fact that here we are, side event at SIDS, and we are in a discussion. But if you look around the room, we have fisher folk in the room. All the fisher folk here, or if there are any here, could you identify yourself? Correct. So the idea is that we have fisher folk involved in these discussions. And I could say that over the last 21 months that I've been involved with this ministry, I have been to a number of engagements and they were present in one form or another, whether it was locally on the ground, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Vincent, here in Antigua, or anywhere throughout the region that I have been. They have been present. And that is fundamentally part of the entire process. Because if their voice are part of creating the policy, and that policy is then taken to whichever level it is, even as it is here now, going into these discussions at SIDS, then ultimately the benefit trickling back down should be down to exactly where it started, with the voice of the fisher folk. And so I think that is a critical component to ensure that their voices form the nucleus of action that moves forward.
I'd like to go to one of our online attendees, who's Mr. Douglas.
To the Honorable Minister and to the esteemed panel. To the speaker, we will just identify the All Tobago fisher folk. We do appreciate it. We come out of Tobago. And some of the observation we would have observed over the years, even in this presentation, is that there was not enough emphasize on the pollutions from this energy company. It has been hardly touched to their contribution to climate global warming, right? And I think we should pay a lot of attention, because on the 7th of February, 2024, Tobago would have experienced a massive oil spill that would have affected the Caribbean. So these are some of the areas we believe that coming out of Tobago, Trinidad and Tobago. We would like to see a bit more fisher folk on the panel to really explain, because we are talking about pollution, about two-stroke and four-stroke engines, but we are not talking about the sustainability of the that light. So we have to understand, because the community that are affected, as the first speaker was talking about, are the poor community. And the people, the boats that is more or stay longer contribute more. These are some of the big trawlers, contribute more pollution. The small man pollution is not as much as that. So these are some of the things and the direction I would like to just, share with the panel and the group in moving forward, and to even have some form of, buffer whereby if we are to engage in electrical vehicle, where are the conditions, where are the suppliers? Is there some form of transition to take? And it all boils down again to finance. And these are low-income earners in the fishing industry, even though the entire Caribbean fishing industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. So I would like to see a bit more emphasis on fisher folk itself on some of these panels, so that they could relate and speak to the day-to-day activities and what we are experiencing in the waters of the Caribbean. Thank you.
What is the economic contribution of the fisheries from your case study to the economy of Belize? And therefore, why should the fisheries sector be prioritized as part of farming as a driver for the economy of Belize moving forward? Thank you.
the assessments that we made were based on revised NDCs that were, provided by our countries into the UNFCCC process, and we assessed those just to get a sense of what the priority sectors are for our member states and what the quantum of need is in terms of resources for both adaptation and mitigation under the NDCs. We know that in the negotiations there has been an amount of 100 billion, since the Paris Agreement mentioned time and again a pledge of 100 billion, and in fact, there was an announcement made at COP28 that they had managed to reach that, but it was in some ways quite underwhelming because that should have been reached a very long time ago. So the idea for me of pledges is sometimes a pledges could be a promise, but it also could be an empty promise. However, just in terms of the allocations and gaps, the intention of the OACPS SIDS-led Resource Mobilisation Conference for NDCs is for our member countries, and particularly our SIDS, to be able to convene and meet with potential financiers and partners with a prepared pipeline of projects, because I think that we've got to now move to that stage where we're saying we need access to climate finance, we need finance, but we need to say actually we need access and we need finance for XYZ. And of course we can't do everything all at once, so the idea would be to focus in on some sectors, and so I mentioned what some of those sectors were for adaptation, coastal management and fisheries, for mitigation, energy, transport and so on. And so I think that if we go with a considered portfolio, it would be far more compelling, and those resources would of course need to be programmed and delivered. And you would, it would not just be for government. I mean, those programs would have to involve many, many others to be able to achieve, the adaptation and mitigation objectives outlined in those NDCs. And I think that this could be a, a considered approach of organising ourselves as SIDS and actually going to our partners and to the international community to be able to see how we attract, the necessary resources for us to be able to address achieving sustainability and building resilience. And so I'm sorry I haven't given you exact numbers, but so I've mentioned 28.7 billion for SIDS per annum. But the overall assessments that we made for the 79 countries is 1.32 trillion by 2030. And those are costed NDCs. So we're not pulling a number out of the air. It's, these are actual numbers that our countries have worked hard to actually, to be able to develop and demonstrate.
I'm Nicholas Watts. I currently chair the Independent Forum of Commonwealth Organisations, and thank you, Milton, for the warm welcome earlier. I have a point about interregional collaboration and another about policy coherence. I noticed we have the regions represented on the panel, and I do wonder with the upcoming Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Samoa, and Samoa has been present here drawing attention to this, whether it isn't time to think about the coherence of institutional arrangements within regions. We have the 5 Cs and the CRFM in the Caribbean, and the Pacific Climate Change Center is now about 3 years old, so building on the 5 Cs policy. But is it not time to make the ask of Commonwealth heads that they put their heads together, so to speak, and come up with a policy approach that is coherent across the regions and where the policy community is listened to. My second point is about, when I talk about policy coherence, I wonder about the talk about the shift of economies to a tourism basis when the marine resources for which tourists frequently travel are disappearing, so that you undermine your tourism sector if you don't deal with fisheries, marine resources, and aquaculture. I think there's the serious problem of fisheries and fishing communities, especially small-scale fishing communities, being politically marginal because they're at the margins, literally in terms of when voting starts, they're out at sea. And there's the lack of visibility, we know, of underwater, undersea life, if we think of SDG 14. And something needs to be done about improving the visibility of these issues. And I think, if we could move towards enhancing visibility of the fisheries sector, that would be wonderful. And I've heard mention of the culture of fishing communities, and my concern as an engaged with the Commonwealth Association of Museums is that many of these communities and many of these cultures will disappear before they're recognized, and we have then the record at least of what was. So I think maybe visibility and the culture through museums could be promoted. Thank you.
So you mentioned Commonwealth heads and policy setting for coherence. I'm saying that policy has to come from us. That's it. We don't ask heads for the policy. I think, and as we in our conversations earlier clear, I think we need to determine, sit together as heads and determine what our priorities are. What do we need the rest of the world to focus on as far as we're concerned? And we have to define that policy ourselves. So we are meeting today. I think there's a meeting with the Pacific Commission, and that is 5 Cs and SPREP. We are forging those relationships, we're strengthening those relationships. And it's a visit by SPREP to Belize next week to meet with us at 5 Cs. And this is a continuing series of engagements we have with them to sort of strengthen the relationships. And we have to extend that to the Indian Ocean countries as well. And yeah, so we're maybe other African states. So that is happening, maybe not fast enough, but at least there's some very concrete discussions being had right now to sort of build and formulate maybe an approach to addressing our situation as SIDS. So that is happening as we speak. The tourism, yes, it's a case of tourism destroying itself. Eventually what attracts tourists to our area is no longer going to be there. We've been in the early days mining beach sand to build hotels, the same beaches that the tourists wanted to lounge on and everything as it is grand because we use sand and beaches to build hotels. But you're right, we have diminishing resources. They're impacted by extreme weather events, and we're embarking on a tourism product that is uncertain for the future. So at some point in time, we need to examine our priorities against the realities of climate change within the region. But that's a bigger discussion needs to be had. And visibility of the fishery sector, absolutely, yes, I totally agree with you. Some museum, something that enhances, it is a vital part of our economies. We grew up with fisheries, it was a mainstay of economies way back then. But not given as much attention as it requires now, but I totally agree that it needs to have a lot more visibility, and maybe that will attract a lot more sort of investments into the sector itself. That's it for me for now. Thanks.
The issue of coherency, policy coherency, it's a big issue. It's an issue at the national level. And we need to do much more to ensure that our policies are more coherent across sectors. Remains a big challenge for us, fisheries, environment, agriculture, industry, all of these things. We still have a challenge in the region, but we're working on it. And we need to continue. And the ACP and other similar mechanisms are very important organizations and networks that's bringing us together. So we are making progress, but I do think we also need to give a little more priority to it. And that's the other point I wanted to emphasize, the issue of priority, because that is so important. And yesterday, you weren't a part of the session, but we did spend some time looking at the ocean economy and the priority being given to it, and the fact that it is really not fully appreciated, the value of the ocean resources, the value now and the value of these resources for the future. In my opinion, our ocean resources are the single most important national asset that we have for our long-term sustainable development. And we discussed that yesterday. But I think the message still needs to be trumpeted, and we really need to ramp up our efforts to improve visibility, to improve understanding among our people, starting with our school children, of the opportunities that we have in the ocean sector and the need to pay attention. You see, we're talking about resilience. We're talking about self-reliance and sufficiency so that we can stand on our own feet, especially in times of difficulty. We have been through an economic crisis some years ago. We have been through the COVID pandemic, and that has opened our eyes to a lot of things. So I do hope that we will take advantage of our recent experiences to reevaluate our priorities going forward for long-term economic development, and ensuring that we choose a path where we develop and utilize all the available resources on land and at sea and under the sea and under the seabed to ensure that we have much stronger, more resilient, and more sustainable economies going forward. I mean, it's imperative, and it requires, again, a lot of investment and effort to move us from where we are now to where we need to go. And within our little sphere, we're trying to address these things, but they require not only money, but institutional, organizational resources and experts. And, you know, all of these are limiting, but, you know, we need to continue to address these things, and hopefully together build that resilient, sustainable future that we aspire to achieve. Thank you.
Need to acknowledge within our regions quite what I would say quite sophisticated, quite mature regional architecture, and you know, within the Caribbean, within the Pacific, and for the African SIDS, who, you know, find themselves both in the straddling the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean. They are working towards, you know, setting up an organisation so that they can work together. What is needed is to have that intra-regional or SIDS regional cooperation and organisation. And we already have, you know, a relationship with the Commonwealth. And I just offer there that, you know, in the case of the ACP or the OACPS, we do, all of our members are developing vulnerable countries from Africa, the Caribbean and the Pacific. And then we have 39 small island developing states as members. And so that coherence does become important. But we need to, I think, as Keith says, start from our regions and then see how we build, you know, a SIDS policy framework that really resonates with the three SIDS regions. The ministerial, the Commonwealth ministerial meeting in Cyprus, you know, not too long ago, and the Ocean Declaration, which will be considered and adopted by or at the CHOGM, is something that will be important for us, and we hope that it doesn't just outline the Commonwealth's policy priorities, but those policy priorities resonate with, you know, sort of a SIDS prioritized agenda. Because Samoa is part of the OACPS, Samoa is currently the chair of AOSIS, and I have quite a close relationship with the ambassador of Samoa in Brussels, who also covers the UK. She keeps me well appraised of how things are going and often checks back in. In fact, she has asked if I could cast my eye over the declaration, and I think for that we need to consult again, you know, this inclusivity and consultation, you know, with members that do have quite an important stake, you know, in matters. And so I think policy coherence is really important, but it has to start from, you know, it has to start, I see it as nested governance, if you like. So we need to see how the different organizations within the institutional ecosystem, how they relate to each other. There's a lot, I think, that the existing regional architecture in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, and in the African SIDS that we can learn from.
Every chance I get to be at a meeting, I'm there. Now the fishers are there. But we don't go beyond this. Right? And we have a lot to contribute. So how do we get from this? Because there's no fishers at SIDS. There will be no fishers where you are in there. There will be no fishers. At anything above us, there's no fishers. So we feel like we've been dictated to. Right? We've been dictated to. Because we have this, when we pose our concerns, when they go up at something else. And then a regulation comes down to us as something else. Right? So we feel, like he's saying, we don't feel visible because we don't go beyond this. So how do we get fishers part of all, like a fisher up there? 2, 3, fisher at the next meeting, 5, 6, something. How do we get, because we have a lot to contribute. And we have concerns about this that needs to be aired to. But all we get when we are, especially, okay, I'll speak about my country. All we get is that we're hindrance. We don't contribute much. That's all we get. We need to have fishers' involvement beyond this. Up there. Thank you.
Let me share from online. We had Mr. Ramon Carcomo earlier, who said that the implementation of the SSF guidelines can contribute to addressing the many challenges presently faced by SIDS. It's been over 10 years since the SSF guidelines were adopted, and very little has been done to implement the guidelines. And then he asks, what are the present plans to action the SSF guidelines? So later on, we'll ask a panelist to address that. And meanwhile, we go back to Christelle.
It's unfortunate, in fact, that that Caribbean small-scale fishers were not present at the 7th ministerial meeting held in Accra, Ghana. We did have representation from the African Confederation of Professional Organizations of Fishers, so CALPA. I don't know if you're aware of, yes, CALPA. LMMA also sent representation, and I do understand that we had reached out to the Caribbean and have not received responses, but we did make every effort. So I want you to write in your little book the dates of the 9th to the 13th of September, because we would very much welcome and yes. So what we will, yes.
I will fund myself and I'll fund somebody else. So we need to get fishers' involvement because they feel really bad about it.
Absolutely.
Right?
And so one of the things that we have also done, and after the 7th meeting held in Accra, Ghana, we also had a side event, especially for small-scale fisheries and for artisanal fishers, where we allowed them to actually participate in the 2nd UN Ocean Conference, looking at progress on SDG 14, but also to celebrate, you know, the year for artisanal fisheries and aquaculture. So I will get your name and your contact details, because, in fact, we were disappointed that that you know certainly Milton and others from the Caribbean ministers were present, but it would have been very good to have had small-scale fishers at the table. So this year in Tanzania, I look forward to being able to see you there and participating in the meetings.
I'm hopeful that it's not just me. I'm hopeful it's not just me.
No, but you can be the contact to your networks, which would be very good. Yeah,
all right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Horton.
Right. Just to follow up on this question, as well as the question posed by Raman Karkamo, because they're connected in some way, and to point out that we have the Caribbean Network of Fisherfolk Organization, and the network has been very, very, very active in advocating and representing the interest of fishers. And it's very important to have that fisher organizational mechanism that you can relate to. So they're members of the Caribbean Fisheries Forum, which is the technical body that discuss technical scientific issues and make recommendations to the Ministerial Council for decision making within the CRFM. In addition, we have regular meetings with the CNFO and usually representatives from all the countries, just following up on various issues. So with respect to the SSF guidelines, we have been working with the CNFO to ensure that their needs and concerns regarding the SSF guidelines are actually addressed. So we have actually a protocol as a part of the Common Fisheries Policy, which was spearheaded by the fishers themselves, supported by others, including CERMES, as part of the University of the West Indies. And they developed the protocol on addressing small-scale fisheries issues, and that protocol was approved by the Ministerial Council and quoted and is a part of the Common Fisheries Policy. We have more recently developed a number of additional instruments, again spearheaded by the Fisherfolk, their own organization, in consultation with the CRFM. For example, the action plan dealing with the 20 by 20 objectives. I don't know if you're all familiar with that, but reducing food import bill by 25% by 2025. Again, working with the CNFO, they actually led with the development of the action plan for the small scale fishers to contribute to that objective. So they also worked with the fishers closely to develop a plan for ensuring that fishers are engaged in the dialogue and development of plans, project strategy, etc., for the blue economic plans and policies at the national level. So what I'm saying here really is that there is at this time quite vibrant interaction with representatives representatives of the small-scale fishers through the CNFO in addressing a whole range of issues, and we meet with the CNFO quite regularly. And the small-scale fisheries guideline that Mr. CARICOM has referred to has been an integral part of our policies, our plans, our work program, where we take this instrument into account and factor in the measures and activities needed to ensure that we are in fact giving adequate priority to implementing the guidelines in our various programs. So projects that we have, all the projects that we have now, have been informed by the provision and commitment of the guidelines, and they are implemented. This instrument, the guideline, is being implemented through the various projects, activities, etc. That we have. Almost all of them have been informed by the commitment.
Thank you. And that ties in well with what Mr. Curtis Douglas had said earlier. He emphasized the need for fisher folk to also be a part of panels like this. So perhaps maybe next time having one at the head table, but also looking at that wider conversation about the transition, especially retooling the sector when you're talking about different types of engines, you know, for them to be more actively engaged and involved in the dialogue, decision making, and so on. I know you talked about the CNFO, but not every fisher belongs to an NFO, to a fisher folk organization. And so how do we get all those players engaged in this dialogue? So we're winding down. We do have some other questions, but we can take some additional interventions from the panel.
Just a very quick one, because during the 7th ministerial meeting, there was a call to action from small-scale fishers, and that's recognised in the declaration of OACPS ministers. And that particular call to action was tabled by CALPA together with a range of other fisheries organisations from the Pacific, from Central and South America, Asia and Europe, and so it does embrace the small-scale fisheries guidelines, which are also reflected in the Strategic Plan of Action for Fisheries and Aquaculture 2030, adopted by ministers in a couple of years ago. But I think it goes back to that whole question of inclusivity and making sure that including all key actors as an underpinning imperative of everything that we do in future, so that we have well-informed decisions and appropriate decisions to be able to build resilience as well as achieve sustainability. So thank you for your question. And the question online.
Thank you too.
Convention on Biodiversity's meeting is taking place in Cali, Colombia this year. So it's pretty close by. It's in October. And mainstreaming biodiversity into the fisheries sector is a topic there. So fisheries and blue ocean biodiversity is a topic that's being discussed. It's just a bit later.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add, because since it came up a couple of times, the CNFO, they weren't able to participate in the Ghana meeting of the ministers responsible for OACP, but they did submit to me some suggestions and for inclusion in the presentation and discussion on sustainable small-scale fisheries. So through that way, they were able to have their concerns addressed, and we did, share the information that we got from the small-scale fishers at that meeting. So just wanted to mention that.
No, absolutely.
Ali Bisram. I'm originally from Trinidad and Tobago, but I now reside in the coastal cities in South Florida, where there's a huge diaspora community, and I run an EcoSoc accredited NGO, and we work really on the intersection of, I love the people-centered question, on human resiliency and planet resiliency, and really putting well-being at the center. And some of that includes tapping back into the wisdom that already exists in people like in Samoa and other places. And part of it also is the work that we've been doing involves some of the listening and also just getting people to fall in love with nature again, and that includes the change makers and the beneficiaries or the folks that are most vulnerable. So I have a question that perhaps it's zooming out a bit from this conversation on just on fisheries, but I think it's connected because we've in the presentations heard a lot the words loss and stress and disaster and the work that we do with our partners is really around filling the gap of social, emotional, psychological resiliency. That's often kind of like an afterthought. And it goes beyond hiring psychologists and etc. The WHO at COP last year had their first climate and health event. And specifically mental health, eco-anxiety, that I realize that there's a real physical need, but then at what point, so my question is really within some of the mechanisms you've presented on, and particularly the vulnerability index, are we incorporating this component? That is a huge factor in resiliency because ultimately it impacts our physical health as well and our ability to be engaged. Because if you're burnt out, you're not going to even engage even if you have the opportunity. And if you don't have the finances to participate, you're not going to be at the table. So it's all connected, and it's totally connected to climate justice as well. So I'd appreciate any interested in opportunities also for funding, because within these are the places where we have to be creative in finding funding to do our work, because there's no mechanism that focuses just on this component. Thank you.
Very important question. And as you mentioned that, I remember a few years ago visiting a few communities in Grenada and St. Kitts, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, as a part of a study looking at the impact of sargassum on, the communities. And as we met and interacted with the community, it really struck me how much anxiety and concerns existed in the communities, just talking to the women and children and so on, regarding the problem of the sargassum inundation and the decay and the terrible smell generated by the sargassum, which is toxic, by the way, and the anxiety that was causing, because people just didn't understand, what is this? They're dealing with this really foul-smelling hydrogen sulfide gas being released, and it just continued, and there are all type of concerns and information about heavy metals and so on. And they were getting bits and pieces, but really didn't quite understand what this means for them. And I see the need for this type of thing, for this, and greater engagement with our health agency. We have CARFO, Carbon Public Health Agency, and I think there's a very important role for them to play in these types of situations, and I think this is only going to get worse. So we do have to put in place, in my opinion, more robust systems to address the mental, psychological, emotional dimension. It is really not something that we're competent to deal with, and so you do need people with the specialization and competency in the area to get involved and to address this. I know there are some NGOs and so on that provide, some support, and that's fantastic. But at the policy level, I think more recognition needs to be given to this dimension of human welfare. We're thinking about some of the basic things like food and shelter and so on. But at the end of the day, the emotional and mental and psychological dimension is just so important for people to function and to enjoy their lives. So I think it's a gap. even though, you know, there's more and more attention being given to it now, it's nowhere near enough, especially given the changes and the challenges and the impacts and the stresses that our people, especially, you know, our women and young children who are less visible, have to deal with and cope with on an ongoing basis. And I tell you, when I saw the situation with the sargassum, it was really concerning. Yes, I realized that a lot more needs to be done. Yeah, and sometimes it's just a matter of having dialogue, talking to the people, explaining, and, you know, sharing the information you have with them. But it is something I think we need to focus more on. So very good point. And I think we should.
Thank
We are required in every project that we develop, we include a section on environmental and social safeguards. And that would fall under the social safeguards in every project. So we do it as a matter of routine. We have ESS, what we call ESS policies, the whole range of policies and gender stakeholder, environmental, social as well. So we it's possible we have not embraced fully the social consequences of those impacts, but we are obligated to doing this, and it's a function of every single project that we land.
And perhaps part of the question is that you don't have to build it. Where's the space for us to come help you build it is part of it.
And we do hire consultants to help build those requirements and obligations within the project, because we don't have all the skill sets, and that's why we use partners to help us address those issues. We need to build them into the projects.
Just on the multidimensional vulnerability index, we know that it's really been sort of a 30-year advocacy program for SIDS. It's been led by SIDS, and mainly due to the fact that, you know, of course, the obvious that we are confronted by we are increasing in vulnerabilities and they are multidimensional. But the main purpose has been to encourage looking at an instrument to access grant and concessional finance beyond the only instrument that's used at the moment, which is GNI per capita. And many of our SIDS have graduated from LDC status, and yet and they're being punished in a way for actually having really worked hard at building their, you know, development and so on. So with the MVI, we've actually followed some fairly specific criteria to contribute to the UN MVI. So there's a bigger, more global process about the MVI. And in fact, in the SIDS 4 outcome document, there's a greater recognition and a heightening acceptance from developed countries, from some OECD countries. The European Union are expressing support for an MVI. So what we need to do is to get that acceptance and then to start to use it. For the OACPS, we developed an MVI which is a little bit different to the UN MVI in that it's more universal, because the UN MVI actually only looks at developing countries and pitches them against each other. We felt that, in fact, we needed to look at universal multidimensional vulnerability. And so we've taken data that's available universally that covers as many member states as possible. So that's one of the criteria that we've used. And we've used very simple indicators and not many, because some of the multilateral financing institutions have said that maintaining an MVI will just be too cumbersome and expensive. And so, of course, you know, they would like to and prefer to use GNI as the determinant. So the UN MVI, as well as ours is a little bit simpler. There's fewer indicators, but it covers economic, social, and environmental indicators, and it's based on the best available data in terms of coverage, so that it gives the tool some transparency and the ability for it to be replicated or reproduced more easily and maintained by our members. The more recent initiative of ours to develop a climate vulnerability and resilience index, again, will just use very few indicators, and again based on data. And we have only just started that development, and part of the work towards COP29 will be to consult with organisations such as KEEPS, the 5 Cs, with SPREP, with with SPC, with and so on in the Pacific, with CARICOM and others, to make sure that the tool is appropriate for our purpose. And the idea again being to use it, and for our countries to be able to use it as a way to access grant and highly concessional finance, because many of our countries and many in the Caribbean don't have access to that, and this is the reason why they're so indebted. So your question about whether we have these very specific health indicators, to be frank, we don't, unless the WHO and other global data centres have collected information. But as part of our work, we're hoping to actually build country profiles and regional profiles so that we can actually infuse them with our data and to collect data that's appropriate for us, because we do feel that the MVI will evolve. However, what we want, the big underlining objective that we have, is that the MVI will become a tool to determine access to grant and concessional finance for all SIDS and vulnerable developing countries, irrespective of their income status. Because that is the most, in fact, that is one of the most overwhelming and challenging things for our countries at this time. And so that's the reason why we've invested time and effort in developing the tool. We're working with the government of Malta and the University of Malta on developing the tool. And they have quite a long history in this area, mainly on economic vulnerability indices. But I think this multidimensional vulnerability index provides, sort of a much richer and a much more robust and considered way of demonstrating why we need access to finance and access to highly concessional finance and grant finance going forward for all SIDS, regardless of income. But these matters of sort of health, sort of what we do when we access the finance, I think it's at that point that it becomes extremely important to look at all facets of what it means to achieve sustainability and, importantly, to build resilience. And it will have to include all of the various sectors, going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to take a question from online.
Murray from based on the CRFM Secretariat. I had wanted to point to three issues. One, the importance of psychosocial considerations in looking at vulnerability. And that came out very clearly when an assessment was done after Hurricane Emily in Grenada. The second thing I wanted to point to is that in terms of the involvement of the CNFO, the CRFM Secretariat Milton has already alluded to it. But just to point out, for example, we're coming up to looking at developing the project implementation plan for the Starfish project, and CNFO has been invited and will be involved in the discussions on that coming up on the 7th of this month. Of June. But in terms of the whole question of importance, vulnerability, visibility, that linkage, I think the lady has already spoken to my concern in that regard, that GDP and GNI are inadequate in terms of determining where we need to go. And the MVI actually provides a mechanism to help us create the fiscal space necessary to overcome some of the structural and external vulnerabilities and build resistance. So I think it's important that we start to push as much as possible and support the development of MVIs.
In Grenada, you said in St. Vincent, those places, the insurance business has been working well for the fisher folks. Pertaining that, you said they haven't even made a claim. Because I think in Grenada and those places up there, they mostly fish for pelagics. And so most of the boats has all the equipment with them, the long line equipment. So once the boat is okay, everything is okay. In Antigua now, we fish more, we do more refishing. So we use a lot of traps. Most boats fish with 100 traps, 200 traps. And so whenever there's a weather pending, sometimes you advise bringing your traps. But you imagine 10 boats trying to bring in 200 traps, and you can see the confusion down at the port. Not only that, once the traps are exposed to the elements on land after being in the sea for a little while, they deteriorate very quickly. So the insurance now in our place, in our situation, would be much, much different. Has anyone given consideration or any thought to branching out to Antigua, what it will be like? Thank you.
Okay, if I may quickly respond, the insurance I was talking about, the main one, the coast, it's a policy that the government will purchase for the sector. And it is not dependent on the loss that you suffer. It is dependent, it's triggered if a particular event or threshold is met. For example, if you're hit by and this is not the reality, it's just giving an example. If you're hit by a Category 3 hurricane, for example, a payout is made, whether or not, and regardless of the loss you suffer. So there are certain trigger events. If those are met, then the payout will be made to the government or to whoever the government designates, for the rebuilding of the fisheries sector or to compensate individual fishers and so on. So those details are worked out in the policy when the government negotiates the policy and the government pays for it. Now, separate and apart from that, there is the type of private insurance that you're talking about, where a private insurer will sell the fisher or the enterprise a policy to cover the losses. Chris is also looking at working out that type of policy, and I know there are other insurers who are interested in providing that type of policy for the fishery sector. In fact, CRIF has what they call a livelihood protection basic policy, very, very basic, where you pay a small amount and you get a quick payout after you suffer some hazard. But going forward, I do hope that more governments will consider the parametric policy that the government purchases for the fishery sector, and it is the exact arrangements would be negotiated with the government and the CRIF and the appropriate payout made. So this is something that I think fishers should be talking with the government representatives about, and in my opinion, lobbying them to sign on to this type of policy because it is in the interest of the industry generally.
Okay, I know Grenada, so as an Antigua government, are you in position to tell me if our government in Antigua has
No, they're not a part of it.
Yeah.
So far, it is only 2, and a number of other countries are looking at it and having discussion with CRIF to join and take out the policy for their country and their fisheries. Yeah.
Mavis George. Quickly, I was just thinking about some recommendations from some of the things that were said. Now, if we're going to try to get persons involved seriously in the fishery sector and contribute, we have to get it in the schools. We have to let the government know If you notice, no school have fisheries on their sub areas. They have agriculture science. So what does that say? Fisheries is not important. For them to take us seriously, we have to get people at the top to let them to pressure the government to let them know that you need to get the universities to have a program for the schools so that the students, they're the next generation. Most of the fisher folks now will die and go off. What do they know? What do these young people know? So that they can be successful in planning our sustainability for food security from this sector. So that is one that has to be done. And the other thing, in terms of the insurance, because I know the government's going to say they have no money. So can this go through maybe like the car? Can they negotiate things like that? And maybe, try to find proper insurance, not only for gears, but for boats and also for loss of income so that persons can, can feel a little more comfortable and also look at this as a viable industry. Because if I'm going to go in an industry and a hurricane pass and everything disappear and that's it, and nobody cares except somebody send me 2 fish pot wire, it's not viable to maintain my family. And if you notice, I think it was Ambassador Joseph who said yesterday, fisheries is the only sector that bounced back after hurricanes. But that's only if you're going after the pelagics. Because if you're going after the demersals, most of your traps are going to be disturbed. So unless you're not going to do something like hook and line or something, you're not going to gain enough to recover and to refinance what you have lost. So that is also important. And in reference to financing, and it's reaching down to the poor sector, finances tend to come. But guess what it does? It supports a consultancy writing a consultant plan. So it's only the people in the middle area receive the finance, and it doesn't trickle down to the lower people. So we need to have the consultancy is important, but after that, what? It stays on somebody's desk. So we need to ensure that whatever finance come down benefit the persons it's really intended to, and even get them to the table. Thank you.
Thank you, lady.
My name is Okama Ekwebrook, and I'm representing today the Caribbean Studies Association. That is an association that is established in Trinidad and Tobago, and we look at Caribbean issues from an interdisciplinary, multicultural, multidisciplinary perspective. So as the president this year, I chose St. Lucia to host my 48th annual conference. We have over 1,000 members who are coming from all over the world to share their research. And I'm so happy that Nicholas, who is sitting here, he is the chair of our environment working group. And he's organizing a field trip during the conference in St. Lucia to visit a fishing community. And the whole idea is that we can engage not only from a scholarly perspective or presentations, we can actually touch base with what is happening at the community level and link those fisher folks with our diasporans, with other Caribbean people who can support this process. So, Madam, it would be so awesome if as a result of the field visit that we are having, we can have a fisher folk from St. Lucia participate in the Tanzania conference. So he's here, I'm tasking him to, he doesn't have the funding, but perhaps this is something we could look at, to have the gentleman from Antigua, representing Antigua and Barbuda, and a fisher folk from St. Lucia, and maybe have a collective that can go and then bring back that information to share here with us.
I want to springboard off that though, because we have to wrap up, but I'd like to tie in with our first question that was asked by Mr. Horsford that had to do with equity, justice, because oftentimes a big part of the problem is that we do not have a level playing field, whether it's a national level, or the global level? And then thinking about the initiative that you just mentioned, the partnerships, the importance of those partnerships. We have many partners here in this room as well as online. And I want to ask, what can we as partners do to collectively ramp up the pressure, one, on the larger developed countries whose economic activities are harming SIDS through adverse accelerated climate impacts, and two, at the national level, the sectors and the industries within SIDS that are the drivers of adverse, and I'll borrow Mr. Houghton's term, synergistic impacts on our marine environment and our living marine resources. Would anyone like to take that?
The discussion is had at the UNFCCC Conference of Parties. This is why we're going into the 29th meeting of the COP in Azerbaijan this year. And this has been the focus of those discussions over the years. There are many other sidebar meetings, the G20, G77, and so on, that all get towards reducing emissions and to reducing impacts on our sectors, particularly for vulnerable SIDS like ours. So the conversation continues. The pressure is on. We are negotiating the terms of reductions of emissions through AOSIS. And like I said, the conversations continues. There's a massive global program aimed at sort of bringing some sort of normalcy to a situation that is spiraling out of control as it is. So yeah, in short, this is what it is. The conversations continue. We are part of the process. We contribute to the discussions. Negotiators have assigned responsibilities for addressing the various thematic areas under, and it becomes a bit more complex, but the conversations continue. And the pressure is put on the developed world to reduce emissions and reduce impacts on cities like ours.
Okay, so where do these partnerships play a role in ramping up that pressure? Yes, Krista.
I'll try to answer that. And in preparation for COPs, we do actually convene not only our members, but also our regional agencies. 5Cs have participated actively in COP preparations, going into COP preparations for an OACPS issues paper. We've done this over the last years, and we intend to do it for COP29. And amongst our competent regional agencies, we also include the various negotiating groups that we're linked to, so AOSIS, G77+, the African group of negotiators, and so on, so that we get a good sense of really how we can, collectively pursue our priorities and our, agenda within those negotiating rooms. So that's something that we can do collectively. But I think also beyond that, we need to take, while the negotiations are ongoing, we also need to translate some things into action. And this is where Keith and I were discussing that, SIDS perhaps need to take the bull by the horns and really think about how we organize ourselves as the 39 SIDS on the blue planet, and how we organize ourselves to not only unite and work together in negotiating rooms, but actually unite and work together on doing something for ourselves. Great. And to also promote the fact that we're not small, we're actually large, that we actually own, if I could say, or we have stewardship over 30% of this planet that we live on.
Yes.
We 5Cs actually convenes meetings of negotiators. We had one in April. These are the technical negotiators. We've got another meeting in October ahead of COP. We bring the ministers together. So technical negotiators in the Caribbean who are assigned responsibilities are discussing the issues and helping to formulate a regional perspective on negotiating position. say in October when we meet with the ministers of CARICOM, and we're working together with CARICOM Secretariat on this, we will sort of consolidate our negotiating position. We do this every year, so this is one way which we can infuse our own suggestions, our own concerns into negotiating briefs for CARICOM and for CIT, but we do this under the banner of AOSIS as well. So we do that as a matter of routine to ensure that we have a say in the process and we contribute to the discussions in the hopes that we can achieve the outcomes that we established in the Paris Agreement.
The road to resilience is not an easy one. It's a rocky road. It's a choppy road, or choppy seas we have to sail through. But I think we just need to remain focused, to stand together, to build the partnerships, and to continue to advocate even more loudly for our interests. And it's really not just interest, it's our survival that's at stake. So we need to continue to raise our voices and engage with our partners so that they understand. And in my opinion, despite the challenges, despite the rocky road and the choppy waters, we will get there if we remain focused and if we stand together. We can achieve profitable, sustainable, and resilient economies based on the resources we have available to us, especially in our ocean space. We just need to remain focused and continue fighting.
I'd like to thank everybody for participating, those online, those in person. And I hope this is not the last in a series of engagement with stakeholders. To CIT's delegates and visitors, I encourage you to take advantage of beautiful Antigua and Barbuda. And I'll close off in saying basically walk good, as the Jamaican brothers and sisters would say.